This week's Parsha is Parshas Chayei Sorah, and we will be discussing the beginning of the Parsha. Mitzvahs hu Avilus, Lis'abel al Hameis. Vayu Chayei Sorah mea shana, ve'esrim shana ve'sheva shana, shnei Chayei Sorah. Vatoma Sorah bekiryas Arba hi Chevron be'eretz Canaan, ve'yovei Avram, lispoid l'Sorah, ve'liv koisa. She'ilto is der Rav Chaygon b'shilti Yudaled, man de shochev le'shchive michayev, lemivkaya, lemispadaya, ve'lemikberaya. If a person loses a close family relative, he needs to cry, to be oisik behesped, and in burial. V'hocha ashkechan ba'Avram Ovinu. The Mishke v'Sorah, be'idan the Mishke v'Sorah, bachya v'sabda v'kavra. So the Shiltus finds in the beginning of this Parsha a source that a person is supposed to cry when losing a family member. Does it prove that it's Minat Torah? No. Anybody familiar with the Shiltus knows that the Shiltus is a compilation of mitzvahs, Torah Shabbat Peh, Sugyas, Mesuda Lefi Parshiyos Shavua. So he always bases the Sugya on one of the Psukim. But none of the great Rishonim quote this Posek as a source to the Mitzvah of Avilus. Is Avilus a Mitzvah D'Oraisa? Sholosh Machloikes Bedavar. The Rambam in the very first halacha in Hilchos Avilus Perek Aleph, halacha Aleph Hilchos Aval. The Rambam's shitta is Avilus D'Yom Rishon Min HaTorah. Avilus Min HaTorah is one day. And the source of the mitzvah is Parsha Shmini. After the tragic demise, the tragic ptir of Nadav Avihu b'nei Aharon, Aharon asks Moshe, "V'uchalti chatos, hayitav be'enei Hashem." I ate the korban chatos. I shouldn't have done so. It is from here that we learn Avilus D'Yom Rishon. The Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, Mitzvah Lamed Zayin, goes further and he says, the mitzvah of koyanim lehitame lemeis is avilus. Because a person is supposed to take care of the mace, that is the mitzvah, even a koyan is metame lemeis. Does the Rambam mean to say that's the source of avilus? No. Sefer HaChinuch, Reish Samech Dalet, in the footsteps of the Rambam says, that the reason the Torah is Metzav HaKohen L'Tam HaMeis is because of Avilus, not the other way around. It is not that we learn Avilus from here. The Rambam himself in Perik Beis Mehilchas Avilus, Halacha Vav, the Rambam writes, Kama Chamura Avilus, how important it is. Even though the Kohen has an Aveira in Isol, Yitam Elemeis, but he should be Metame to the Shiva Kroivim, because a person is supposed to be mitzdayer u'mis'abel and take care of his family relatives. So the Rambam maintains, and that is the shit of the Rif, Brochas Daf Yud Omud Aleph in the Dapim of the Rif, first day Minat Torah, Shivas Yemei Avilus Midrabanan. However, the Rif quotes, Ike meravoto, Yesh Marabuseinu, they maintain Shivas Yemei Avilus Minat Torah. And that seems to be obvious from the Yerushalmi in Moyed Kotten Daf Yud Daled. But most of the poskim follow in the footsteps of the Rambam. No. Whatever the sources brought in Yerushalmi are just a smachta, Shivas Yemei Avilus Midrabanan. Even though Yosef HaTzadik, Pashas V'yechi V'yas L'ovev, Mispad Shivo Yomim, yes, that's the minig of Yosef HaTzadik. He was Mechadish Shiva Yomim, but Minat Torah, Yom Aleph. Yesh Marabiseinu, quoted in the Rif, Tesomet Beis Mesechet Broches, Shivas Yomim Minat Torah. The Ramban in Torah Sa'odam maintains Avilus is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, even the first day. It is not a mitzvah d'Oraisa. So what was Aaron HaKohen's question? V'ochalti chatas hayitav be'enei Hashem. That is because of aninus and not avelus. Aninus is a sugya b'fnei atzmai. I think last year in Parshas Chayesora, the shiur was about aninus. Today we're discussing avelus. What is the essence of mitzvahs or avelus? Fascinating Rashi. Sukkah Chof Hayom Adalef. Rashi explains the Gemara. Chosen, poter men ha-mitzvahs. Ovel eineno poter men ha-mitzvahs. And the Gemara asks why? Oisik b'mitzvah poter men ha-mitzvah. So a chosen is busy. He's engaged with Torah the mitzvah. So is a novel. And the Gemara says no. Chosen is oisik b'Torah the mitzvah. Simcha for a chosen is a mitzvah. And ovel is oisik b'Torah the reshus. It is not defined as Torah the mitzvah. Rashi explains, Ovel chayev linog avelus lekvoid hameis. Einoi mitzvah liois bitzar. A novel doesn't have a mitzvah to be sad, to be in sorrow. He has the mitzvah to perform, to be makayim mitzvahs avelus mishum kvoid hameis. Some great halachic authorities understand that Rashi, he doesn't need to be sad at all. He doesn't need to be sorrow. He just needs to go through the acts because that's kavod hameis. To me, this is so unreasonable. What are dinei avelus? Chamishu inuyim. Chamishu inuyim are tsar. If he doesn't need to be bitzar, why does he need to be noyeg minhogei tsar? Is it just to pretend? To make believe? People should think he's bitzar? No. Einem es yashvar alev doesn't make sense. So how do we understand Rashi? And Rashi says the same eksubas davava mit beis, but in Sukkah it's more mefurish. And I want to prove the point, l'choyre Rashi is right from another Gemara, dav chof hayom mit beis. The Gemara says, mitztaya potam in a sukkah, aval oval chayiv v'sukkah afar pishu mitztaya. When you're in distress, when you're pained, when you feel bad, when you're sad, it's even tougher and more difficult to sit in the sukkah. So why doesn't he have a ptur of mitzvah potam in a sukkah? And the Gemara says, he should make an effort. He should not be so troubled and minimize your stress and your pain. So that proves Rashi's point. But as I will explain in the next 15 minutes, to me it's poshet. Oval Olov liois betzar. He should be betzar, yes. He should be sad. He should be in sorrow. So let's check out a few sugyas in Divrei Arishonim. Moed Koten Chov Zayin Amid Beis. Shloisha lebechi shiva lamisbet shloishim letispeiros. 3 days are dedicated to crying. 7 for hesped. Shloishim la'avelus. Tispeiros is one of dinei avelus. So the Gemara clearly says shloisha lebechi. Doesn't that prove that you're supposed to cry the first 3 days? If we don't have a mitzvah to be betzar, then why do we need to cry? Would we once again say, make believe you're betzar, make believe you're crying, pretend? No. Shloisha lebechi means shloisha lebechi. The Aruch LaNer on the spot in Sukkah, Chafei, not in Moed Koten. The Aruch LaNer says, shloisha lebechi means shloisha, not more than 3 days. But it's a gewaldige deichik. Because we can be mefarash shiva lamisbed shloishim letispeiros, that the kavanah is not more than 7, not more than 30. No. Shiva lamisbed means 7 days dedicated to misbed and shloishim days lavedis, and the same as shloisha lebechi. Shabbos Kuf Nun Aleph Amid Beis, an amazing story. Rav Chanina, one of the greatest Amiron, Talmido Shel Rabbeinu HaKodesh, Shchiv Elei Brata, a young girl, his daughter passed away, and he didn't cry. And his wife was troubled and terribly dismayed. And she asked him, Tarnagulta afikas mebeisa? Is there a chicken that you threw out of the house, that you removed from the house? Your daughter passed away. Why aren't you crying? And he responds and he says, Tichlo va'avira. He had an eye disease, and the doctor said crying would further damage his eyesight. He might lose his eyesight, so he apologizes and he says, Tichla va'avira. The tragedy is big enough. We're heartbroken. Do you want me to go blind as well? And the Sfas Emes on the spot asks, how, but there's a mitzvah shlo yishulabechi. So first the Sfas Emes wants to be mefarish like the Orach Haner. Doesn't mean you need to cry 3 days. It means not more than 3 days. But it's not mashma the Gemara. Rabbi Yankov Emden, in his Agoas al Shas, on the spot Shabbos Kuf Nun Aleph, he also wants to say betchila. Doesn't mean you need to cry 3 days. It means not more. But he says no. That's not a perush ha'mesyashav al alev. So he says he was an oines. Like he explains, like he apologizes, tichlo v'aviro. I don't think Rabbi Yankov Emden means the concept of oines. There is no ptur of oines only if a person is coerced and forced by an external force. I think what Rabbi Yankov Emden means to say, I wrote in many sources in my Sforim, primarily in the Tshuvas. If performing a mitzvah will cause you illness, definitely if you might jeopardize the function of one of your bodily functions, you're potem in a mitzvah. Definitely if it might cause blindness. Some achronim maintain mutar l'chal Shabbos afilu b'melocha d'oraisa to prevent a person from losing his eyesight. That's a big halachic discussion. Hilchas Shabbos has nothing to do with our shiur today. But it definitely is poshut that an oval is not mechuyev to cry if he might damage his eyes. So that is what Reb Chanina says, apologizing to his wife. It hurts me as it hurts you, but I can't sacrifice my eyes, and therefore I'm trying not to cry. But Rav Yankov Emden sees it as a milsa de pshita. Pshaten de Gemara shloisha lebechi means you need to cry 3 days. What is Avelus all about? Seems to be a machlokes in Rishonim. I quoted Rashi Kvoid HaMeis. Minog Avelus is Kvoid HaMeis. The Rambam in Perek Yud Gimel of Hilchos Avel writes, Achayit and Eliboy, and Avel is supposed to do tshuva. He's supposed to think about tragedy, about loss, and it should bring him to cheshbon and nefesh and to tshuva. The Rambam writes the same in the beginning of Hilchos Taniyos regarding when tragedy strikes the tzibur, not the individual. The Rambam writes we need to understand that there's hashgacha pratis. It's not just coincidence. And if a person thinks it's coincidence, that's midas achzorius. You need to believe and understand if tragedy strikes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is calling out to us. And He wants us to repent and to do tshuva and come closer to Him. So the Rambam Perek Yud Gimel of Hilchos Avel writes the same regarding tragedy that strikes an individual and a family, not only the tzibur. Realize that tzibur needs to do tshuva when it's a communal loss or tragedy. Same regarding the individual. And that is what Avelus is about. It's about crying. It's about sadness. It's about tshuva. Is there a machlokes between Rashi and Rambam? I don't think so. I think they supplement each other's. So Rashi and the Rambam deal with two different aspects of Avelus, and they fit in Shleimus Uinyan, and they supplement each other. Rashi speaks about minhoge Avelus, dine Avelus. Why is it important to be noyeg minhoge Avelus? That is kvoid hameis. But what is Avelus all about? Why is Avelus important? Not referring to the various minhogim and dinam of Avelus. Atu yitzram, atu hu yoitzram, va'atu yodeya yitzram. Yes, we cry and we're deeply, profoundly saddened when a loved one passes away. And why is that? we should do tshuva and come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Rambam is explaining the essence of Avelus, while Rashi is explaining why is important Dinei Avelus. But I want to come back to what I'm trying to prove. Bechi is what we are supposed to do. And when Chazal say Shloisha lebechi, Shiva lemisbot, Shloisha mitespoides, it means that is what is expected of a novel. That's his mitzvah. That's his mitzvah. Tshuvas HaRadbaz, Chelek Gimel Tov Kuf Nun Hey. And I quoted this Radbaz many times because I think it's so important. Chelek Gimel Tov Kuf Nun Hey, the Radbaz was asked about a Odom Godel, a great Talmid Chacham, lost a son, and he didn't cry. And people were in a spoil. And the Radbaz was asked, does that prove he's a big tzaddik? And the Radbaz writes, he's an achazah. He's cruel. And he was noeg minig achzorius. Because Chazal say shloishu lebechi. So the Radbaz understood shloishu lebechi, just as I explained. Kipshutoi shel davar. If Chazal say shloishu lebechi, it means we are supposed to cry. And if that person didn't cry, minig achzorius. I just want to once again note that the Rambam in Chastanius writes, when people will be toilet in coincidence and they wouldn't do tshuva, ze minig achzorius. Interesting that Radbaz uses the same expression, noag minag achzorius. You need to cry. The tzibah needs to cry when tragedy strikes, and the individual as well. Many, many years ago, I recall paying a shiva call to a great Talmid Chacham. His wife passed away and she was quite young. And he had a big smile on his face. And everybody that came in, he said, people say Sevet Zayin gut. No, says Yetz gut. I'm happy. Everything is okay. I was turned off. I was troubled. And rightfully so. The Radbaz writes, if he didn't cry, that's minig achzorius. The Ramban in Pashas Achrei Meis, in the Isur of Krocho Lemeis, HaTorah lo asra et habechi. Derech hanoshem livkois behi poreid hu oihavim. When lovers part, they cry. And that is the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu made us. VaTorah lo aseret et habechi. We believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We believe in His infinite and ultimate goodness. But we're hurt. And we're pained. And we cry. And that is what we're supposed to do. That is what Avraham Avinu did. Vayavai Avraham lispod lesora v'levkoisa. And that is what the She'ilta says. We started off today's shiur with the She'iltas. Mechayev, inish, lemivkei, lemisbedei, lemikberei, hocha ashkechin ba'Avraham Avinu. That is what the Radbaz makes clear. And that is what we see in Moed Katan and Masechet Shabbos. Beis Yosef, Shimon Pei in Hilchas Avelis, Simon Shin Pei, Beis Yosef says, why do Chazal Asar Siyas Malocha Ba'avel? An Avel can't work, he can't be engaged in manual labor. When people are busy, they're busy with their business, they're busy to make money, they're busy with their job, they're Mesiach Das, and they won't cry. So it's clear from the Beis Yosef as well, it is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects you to do. So how do we understand Rashi? Eino mitzvah lehitztayar. So let me explain. And it's dakus. But I think it's Teiras Emes Le'emitoi. There is no mitzvah mugderes to cry. A novel doesn't have a mitzvah to cry. The mitzvah of Avelis is not necessarily crying. Linoik dinei Avelis. Kavoid ameis. But it is human nature to cry. And if that is the Kodesh Baruch Hu, that is the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu made us, then that is how an ovel is supposed to feel and supposed to act and supposed to be. That is the essence of Avelis. So one cannot say, Sheyesh chiyuv livkois. But Chazal did dedicate 3 days. 3 days for Bechi. Let it out. Let the tears flow. And that is Mishum Kavod HaMeis. Hayesh bizoyen lemeis, that he died and the family is happy. No one mourns him. No one misses him. So Rashi writes, Einu chayev lehitztayer, but chayev linagavelis mishum kavod hameis. And the tsar is part of kavod hameis. L'maynaf gemina. Rashi explains the Gemara. The Gemara says, Simchas chosan is simcha shel mitzvah. Tsar or ovel is not mitzvah. It's not terde the mitzvah. I think we need to understand the fundamental difference between simcha and sadness. They are opposites. Simcha is one of the most important fundamental characteristics of an Oved Hashem. Minchaso shekroli HaMitzvahs, Siman Yud Gimel. There's an entire siman dedicated to simcha. And I think I wrote about 15 different levels and concepts on sugyas of simcha, all positive. Simchas HaTorah and Simchas HaMitzvah, Simchas HaAvodah and Simchas Yomtiv and Simchas Chosan Vekala, Beis HaShoyevo. I explained there are many different expressions and manifestations of simcha. But simcha is one of the great positives in Yiddishkeit. Tsar and atzvos is a negative. It is a negative sentiment. It brings lidei aveira, not to lidei simcha. So when a chosan is sameach, it is the mitzvah to be happy. And we need to maximize that simcha. When a ovel is b'tzar, we need to try to minimize the tsar. We have a mitzvah of nicham avelim. It goes without saying, if we have a mitzvah lenachem, then the avelim have a mitzvah lehisnachem. If the Torah doesn't want them to be consoled, why do we have a mitzvah to try to console them? So I think if the Torah gives us a mitzvah nicham avelim, it's a rotzon Hashem that the avelim should be mischazik and misnachem. We need to try to take away their tsar. Yes, they have to be b'tzar. It's human nature. It's what Avraham Avinu did. It's what we're supposed to do. But the terda of tsar is not a terda of the mitzvah. To the contrary, the mitzvah is to try to ease their tsar and ease their pain and try to minimize the tsar. So the terda, the simcha is a terda shel mitzvah. The terda of tsar is not a terda shel mitzvah. And that is why we learn in Sukkah Chafayom et Beis. Sukkah, ovel chayev b'sukkah. Iboya leile esu v'daita. We know you're b'tzar, but you need to try to minimize that tsar. And that is the kavanah of Rashi. Eino chayev liyois b'tzar. So I hope I'm making myself clear. It is Rotzon Hashem that a ovel should be b'tzar. It is Kavod HaMeis. Person passed away, we'll never see him again till Tchias HaMeisim. We hope it'll be B'Korev. But that is profound sadness. It's the saddest aspect of the human experience, is Avelos. That is the way Avraham Avinu responded when Sarah passed away. It's the way Klal Yisrael responded when Moshe and Aaron passed away. The Shavotim when Yaakov Avinu passed away. It is what the Radbaz says, Oisei Chochem, that didn't cry, Menegach Zorius. But the Torah wants us to minimize the pain and to be mechazik and avel. And that is why the terda of tsar is not a terda de mitzvah. He needs to be noyeg menagaveles mishum kvoid hameis, and kvoid hameis is being sad. Aval ein lehis abel yoiser medai. And that is why we tell the ovel, make an effort to sit in the sukkah. It's man simchoseinu. Make an effort to be happy. Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want you to maximize the tsar, but try to minimize. Lefi darki, yesh li yashiv. What troubles Reb Shlomo Zalman? Moron Reb Shlomo Zalman Oyabach, Mincha Shlomo Chelik Beis Mitzadik Vav. Reb Shlomo Zalman talks about Rashi. Eino Ovel Chayav L'Tzar, and he wonders, so why does an Ovel have an Isser on Talmud Torah? Because of Kudei Hashem Yeshua Mesam Chelev. An Ovel doesn't learn Torah because it's Mesamech. So what if it's Mesamech? Why do we care? There is no mitzvah liyois b'tzar. And Reb Shlomo Zalman is nidchak. Maybe we're afraid he's going to be so happy that everybody's going to see he's happy, and then it's not kavod ameis. On the other hand, Reb Shlomo Zalman asks, why is over muta b'shtiyas yayin? V'yayin yisamach levinoish. And once again, Reb Shlomo Zalman suggests a gewaldige doichik. And he says that yayin it will alleviate the sadness of the sad, and it will bring simcha to those that are not sad. But it wouldn't achieve two steps. Take you out of your sadness and bring you into simcha. Could we quantify and exactly how far yayin will take you? To me, kushimi korelesa. And Aval is sharui b'tzar, profoundly sad. He has a mitzvah to try to alleviate his pain and his sorrow and his anxiety. So he's entitled to drink wine. He's entitled to drink wine. But on the other hand, you're not supposed to be in simcha, and definitely not in excess of simcha. So mutar le'lilmod Torah b'devorim haroim, lo b'devorim hamesamchim. So this is the way I understand the essence of Avilos. Almost all the shiurim I've given in the past few months, I also touch upon COVID-19. So I was asked by many Rabbonim in the past few months, especially in the first wave, which was a total shock, especially in America. I think in the East Coast about 1,500 or somewhat more Hamisha people passed away. Do we need to be noyeg minhag avelis? The Ramosh Shin Ayin Daled Yoredeya, Sif Yud Aleph writes, Yesh oimrim shebishas hadever ein noyagim avelos. V'shomati k'tzas noyagim came. So the Ramo writes, B'shas Avev, B'shas Magefa, there are no Dinei Avelos. The source is Chuvas Maharil. And the Meril writes, Mishum Bi'asuso, because of fright. What does that mean, Mishum Bi'asuso? Because of fright. That is why there are no Dinei Avelos. So the Levush in Sif Yud Aleph and the Maharshal and Bava Kama, in Perek Merubah, Perek Vav, Simachofei, quoting the Gemara, Dever be'ir kaneis raglecho. The understanding of the Levush and the Marshal is people might die from anxiety, from pachad, when a Megefa is raging and nobody knows who's going to be next. And that is why we're not noyag minhoge avelus. The Levush writes, Hadimyon poyol b'shas ha-Megefa. Your imagination will go mad and people will exaggerate and they will get into terrible anxiety. That's one interpretation. Divrei Malkiel. Rav Matasyahu Tenenbaum, one of the great poskim in Lithuania, who was the Rav of Lamzha, Chelik Beisim and Tzadik, has a lengthy tshuva about this question. And he has a new interpretation. Lama ein misablin b'shas ha-Megefa. And what does the Maril mean be'asusa? Fright. And he ties it into another psak of the Marul. B'shas ha-Megefa, you need to run away, leave the city, go elsewhere. Divrei Malkiel says these both halachas are two sides of the same coin. We don't want people to know the numbers. We don't want people to know how many people died. And that is why we say run away. And if everybody leaves town and everybody goes elsewhere, and in those days people didn't have WhatsApp, email, couldn't even text message, couldn't even voice message, didn't have cell phones, they didn't even have telephones or telegraphs. So when people left the city and each of them went elsewhere, they had no idea mi yichya v'mi yomis, who's dead, who's alive. And the principle is we don't want people to know numbers because they might be shocked, they might be depressed, and it might cause the loss of life. I do not think these two halachas are necessarily two sides of the same coin. We discussed many times the halacha of running away, leaving the city. I think it was just about to prevent the spread of infection. But anyway, that's the mahalach of the Divrei Malkiel. Reasoning number 3 is the Shoel HaMeishav in two different sources. Tshuva Shoel HaMeishav, Madura Aleph Chelak Aleph Siman Ayin Ches, and once again in Divrei Shoel Yoredei Hilchos Avelis Siman Shin Ayin Dalet. Shoel HaMeishav is Medayek Rashi. Novi Yecheskel Chov Dalet Chov Beis. B'mokem she'ein menachmin, ein misablin. If there's no one there to come and be menachem ovel, you don't need to sit Sheva. It's a gewaldige chiddush. So the Shoel HaMeishav writes, because in days of yore, the Marilim says, you need to leave town. So everybody ran away, everybody was in a different town, they were all dispersed, so how would they know if one of their friends died? And therefore it's Mokem Shem Menachmim. Mokem Shem Menachmim ein misablin kimavur berashi. The fourth interpretation is the Tzafnas Paneach. I don't think it's in his Tshuvis, the Rogatchover. Tafresh Ayin Aleph, in a periodical called Hama'asef, the Rogatchover was asked, do we have Avelis B'Shas HaMagefa? Are we knowing Minig Avelis during an epidemic? And the Tzafnas Paneach has his own novel, unique interpretation, and he says, once upon a time, B'Shas Magefa, they were oisik and kvuris arai, temporary burial, because they didn't want people to come together at Levayis. How different is it than today? Thousands of people come to Levayis with no distancing, with no mask, and spread the disease. So the Tzafnas Paneach writes, B'Shas HaMagefa, they didn't go out to the Beis HaKvoros, and each of the Mesim got temporary kvura, hoping that Bekorav they will be able to take to their Kviyasdika Beis HaKvoros. And therefore there weren't Noig Avelis. So the Tzafnas Paneach writes, we don't have that many today. And even in the times of a epidemic, we take every mace out to the Beis HaKvoros, and he has a Kvuras Keva in his Chelkas Keva, and therefore we do sit Shiva. So I was asked many times, why do we sit Shiva? And I expressed my clear psak, of course we need to sit Shiva. And I'll explain why. I think the majority of the Poskim rejected this minhag. Knesset Agdoila, Schoil Avram, many others. Even the Ramah writes Yesh Oimrim. The Ramah quotes the Maril on a steady basis. We don't find any of the Rishonim that's choilek on the Maril, so why does he write Yesh Oimrim? Beyond that, the Ramah writes Shumati Ktsas Noyagim Kain. Shumati. Anybody familiar with the Ramah and Dalat Shechanoch, the Ramah is not only a poisik, he is Korvei the Minhogam of Kiras Ashkenaz. And in almost every other sif, he writes, Kach Noyagim Bum Koimeinu, Kach Ra'uil Ninoik, Kach Noyagim. Shomati Ktsas Noyagim Ken. I heard. That proves that B'Mekoimoy Shel Ramah, he was not Korvei this minig. The Ramah wasn't Noyag Kain. Shomati Ktsas Noyagim Kain. So I think that proves that in the Ramah's opinion, and that is Minig Ashkenaz, one should be Noyeg Minig Avelis. So many Achronim do quote the Ramah, most notably Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, Dei Yeshim and Beis. But I don't think the Chasam Sofer writes Kach Noyagim. The discussion of the Chasam Sofer is those that aren't noyeg avelis b'shas megeva, do they need to make up for it when the megeva is over? Or do we say, kivin shenitche nitche? That is the discussion of the Chassam Sofer. He doesn't go into details. Is that our minhag or not? So because the Rama writes, Shomati ktsas noyagim kein, and many are choilek on the Rama, I think das yochid, and we are noyeg minhag avelis. Zilboser tama. I mentioned 4 svaras. What is the origin and the rationale of this minhag? I think all 4 are not noyeg bisman hazeh. Be'asusa. The Marshal, the Levush explain, people, if they're noyeg avelis, they'll go visit the avelim, they will sink deep into depression, anxiety, there might be suicides, people might die, pikuach nefesh. I don't think that's realistic today. We visit avelim, but our hearts are hardened. Just want to mention a machshava I once had. A Masechet Ksubis, there's a machlokes in the Gemara. Anocha shaveres chutzi gufa shel adam or kol gufa shel adam. A groan, a krechts. You know what a krechts is? In Yiddish is a krechts. A groan is not like a krechts. But anyway, does a groan break a half of a person's body or the whole body? Strange. We krechts all day, we groan all day, and our groans don't break half of our body, and definitely not the whole body. Obviously today, everything is menasof v'lachutz. Your krechts as well. They had open hearts of love, of warmth, of compassion, of feeling for their fellow Jews. We're different. So in their days, they were afraid. Be'asusa. People will sit shuva. You'll come to visit them. You'll be so moved, so depressed. Might affect your health, the health of the community. I don't think that's a real chashash today. David Markiel says we don't want them to know the numbers. We know the numbers today. No secrets. Whether you sit avelis or not, we know the numbers. We should know the numbers. To my dismay, many people don't want to know the numbers. Many people just don't care. Many people don't count. I wish they would more know the numbers. I wish there would be more biasusa. I wish there would be somewhat more feeling and depression in our camp. So I don't think the reasoning of the Demarkiel is relevant today, because we know the numbers from 1,000 different ways. Shalom Eshev says, I don't think people should go visit their friends for Nechom Avelim, especially not in those places where the disease is rampant. But just a week ago we discussed, could you be Mekayim Bikacholim with a telephone call or a Zoom call? And it was a suffix. I think Nechom Avelim is more reasonable that you could than Bikacholim, because last week we explained Bikacholim, you need to see the person's pain and daven for him. Nechom Avelim is not about davening. You need to see his pain and care for him, and try to alleviate his pain. We do not find this interpretation by Nechom Avelim. Nechom Avelim is just giving him some chizuk. You could do that on the phone, you could do that with Zoom. So we cannot say, B'mukim she'ein menachmim, ein mis'avlim. And the interpretation of the Tzavras Menach definitely isn't shaykh these days. He already writes, in his generation, we bury the dead in Beis HaKvoros, not temporary kvura, but permanent kvura, and therefore there is no reason not to hold divrei avelos. I just have an additional feeling. I explained many times in the past few months. Lo hareizeh kahareizeh. There were epidemics in which the population was decimated. In the bubonic plague, the Black Death, the estimate is between 1/3 and 50% of the population died. We cannot know exactly going back 500-600 years, but the estimate is between 30 and 40 million people in Europe perished. There were other epidemics in which very few people died. And I think this din, she'ein noegim avelis, is probably only relevant in those awful pandemics in which tens of thousands of people died and the Jewish communities were ravaged and destroyed. As bad as COVID is, and you have heard from me many, many times how strongly I feel about following the rules. Every death is one too much. But statistically, the numbers are relatively small, unlike many epidemics in the past. And therefore, I think, in an epidemic like this, I think all the poskim would agree, sheyesh linhoig minhag avelos. And that was my psak. So today we discussed the Mitzvah of Avelos, Vayavoy Avraham Lispoid Lesora Velevkoisa, and we touched upon various halachas, especially Avelos during COVID-19. So this week, we say goodbye to Avraham Avinu and to Sarah. At the beginning of the parsha, very first pasuk, Chaye Sora Mea Shona V'Yesrim Shona V'Sheva Shona Man, very well known Rashi, Bas Sheva Ke Bas Chav Ke Bas Kuf. We find the same in the Hemshech of the parsha. V'Eli Yemei Shnai Chay Avram, Asher Chay Mea Shona, Shivim Shona V'Chomesh Shonim, Ben Chomesh Ke Ben Esem Ke Ben Mea, V'Yigma V'Yomes Avram, V'Seivo Toy V'Zoken, V'Saveya V'Yosef El Amav. Avraham Avinu was one out of three, one of the three of Aviseinu Akdoshim, but he stands out and he was unique. Ad Kedei Kach. We find in Medrash Bereishis Rabbah Perek Parsha Yud Beis, Eile told us Shemayim V'Oretz Behi Bar'am Oisias Avraham. Lo nivrahu Eilem Elo B'Shvel Avraham. Ein Oilem Eskayim Elo B'Shvel Avraham. Told us Shemayim V'Oretz Behi Bar'am Be'Avraham. What was unique about Avraham Avinu? So many things. He was the first to come to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on his own. Since Avraham Avinu, Doir ledoir yeshabach masacha, avos ibonim, avhan ubinan. It is the greatest obligation of every father, of every mother, to pass on the torch to the coming generation. No one passed down the torch to Avraham Avinu. All he saw in his father's home was avodah zarah. And Avraham Avinu on his own came to the realization, ha'efshal ha'manig b'li biro, until he was zeicher to revelation, at shehitzas of balabira va'omar anihu baal habira. It is one way in which Avraham Avinu was unique. Kiyam Avraham Avinu kol ha'torah kula ad shelo nitno. He not only achieved emunah and betochen, mit ruach hakodesh, he was zeicher to understand all the mitzvahs and to perform them. The Rambam, in the beginning of Hilchos Avodah Zorah, describes Avraham Avinu, Alofim v'ravavis neskapsu elev, oyo koire bekoil godoil, and he taught them emunah and betochen. The Lechem Mishnah on the spot explains. It's a Gemara 3 times in Shas. Shit alfin shnin havi alma. Alpaim shnas toihu. Alpaim shnois toiro. Alpaim shnois yemoisa Moshiach. And the Gemara asks, Matan Torah was hundreds of years after the first 2,000 years. So how do we say Alpayim Shnois Torah? And the Gemara answers, Alpayim Shnois Torah start not with Matan Torah, but with Avraham Avinu as a Nefesh Asher Oso B'Choron. And the Lechem Mishnah asks, but Noach taught Torah, Shem ve'Ever taught Torah. The difference is, Shem ve'Ever sat in their homes, and if somebody wanted to come to learn, they were teaching. Same with Noach. Rak Avraham Avinu nis oirer likroi b'shem Hashem. He went out there. He went out there. He brought thousands, tens of thousands to Emunah. And that is why Alpayim Shnais Torah start with Avraham Avinu. What else do we know about Avraham? Asora Nisyonis Nisnas Avraham Avinu va'omed b'kulam. And I explained 4 weeks ago. Rashi, Perekei Mesechet Avos v'lo hirher achrei midhoisai. V'hemin b'Shem v'yachshavoi eloi tzedakah. And the Rambam Perek Yud in Hilchos Shuvah writes that Avraham Avinu was the greatest oyev Hashem. Zera Avraham Ohavi. What else? V'Avraham Zoken Bo B'Yamim. And in this week's Parsha we also learn Avraham v'Sora Zakenim Bo'im B'Yamim. Sora and Avraham were a team. They were the same. The Zohar Kodesh Kuf Chof Tes Omed Aleph Chelek Aleph Bereishis. Bo B'Yamim means he brought with him all his days. Every day was a day of ahavo and yero and service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and teaching Torah and Amunah. Every day. Liyased Lavai. Kadosh Baruch Hu will take out a calendar. Or maybe a clip. Day after day will come and testify. And the person will see how he spent his days and his nights. Very few will be proud of what they see. That Avraham Zakam Bo B'Yamim. Avraham V'Sona Zakenim Bo'im B'Yamim. Every day was a day to be proud of. Every day was a day of Avodas Hashem. Of Avodah for Klal Yisrael. This Vasemes Shnas Tofreish Lamed Aleph Tofreish Lamed Gimel, quoting the Chidush Yerim, his great-grandfather. This Vasemes says, every day was a day of growth. And every day Avraham Avinu came even closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and achieved heights that he never achieved before. That is Bo B'Yamim. Every day was compounded, like compound interest. Every day was built upon the achievements of the day before. Bo B'Yamim. In the history of Hasidus, there was a Rebbe in Poland that was called the Yid HaKudish, the Heilige Yid. And the Polish Tzaddikim said he became a Jew every day. Every day he felt as if this is his first day. Like a ger feels when he converts. I did geras many times, and I can't even describe how moving it is when a person feels, now I came to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right now, I'm Zoicha Lachsois Tanchas Kanfi Ashchina, Lavoi Bibris. Avraham Zokam Bo B'Yamim. Every day was a new day. And like the Yid HaKodesh, every day was a day of B'chol yoyim v'yoyim yiyu be'einechu kechadoshim. And that is Avraham Zokam Bo B'Yamim. What else? V'Hashem berech es Avraham b'koil. What does this word mean, b'koil? Many different interpretations we find in Chazal. Ma'orinayim Pashas v'yetzei, one of the great Hasidic leaders and masters and Rabbeim. His interpretation is based on one of the fundamentals in the Baal Shem Tov's Torah. B'chol drochechu dayehu. The Rambam writes, B'kol drochechu. Not only Maisa Mitzvah, everything. One of the fundamentals in Torah Baal Shem is nothing in the world could be pure evil. Because pure evil cannot exist. In creation, Basara Mamoros Nivru Oilam, and the Beshem HaKodesh says, Mefarish, La'olam Hashem Dvorcho Nitzav B'Shamayim, Dvorcho Nitzav B'Shamayim, those 10 Mamoris, it wasn't a one-time event. Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world, and now it runs on its own. They're still up there. So nothing can exist without a Nitzitz Kodesh, without the Nitzitzes, the spark of Kedusha. Otherwise it would just evaporate. Cannot be. Ein Ra Muchlat ba'olam, Torah's the Baal Shem Tov. And therefore, everything a human being must do and must be engaged in could be and should be Avodas Hashem. The Baal Shem Tov fits in wonderfully with the Rambam in Hilchos Deis. Kol masecho Yiras Shem Shemayim, the Rambam is mefarash, Kol masecho is Ma'aser Rishus. B'chol dorochecho dayehu. When a person eats and drinks, he needs to have in mind, She'ei gufoi chozek v'bori la'avodas Hashem. V'nimtzu ha'olech b'derech hazeh oivedas Hashem kol yomov. V'Hashem berech es Avraham b'koil. Avraham Avinu's avodas Hashem was holistic. You need to be an Oved Hashem not only with your tzitzis and your tefillin, with your socks and your boots. Everything belongs to Kodesh Baruch Hu, and everything belongs to His service. And whatever you do could be and should be Avodas Hashem. And that's the interpretation of the Me'orei Einayim, V'Hashem Berech Es Avraham B'Koil. So as we finish the story of Avraham Avinu and we move over to Yitzchak, just a time to remember, and we learn the story of the others. We need to try to emulate their ways and to learn from the fundamentals of their Hanaga. And when we say so, and we try to emulate their ways and follow in their footsteps, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu remembers Schus Avos and Chaz Avos. We should be Zoicha in the Schus of Avaseinu HaKadoshim, only to be Mevasa B'Seiros Toivos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should take this Mageifa away, and we should only be Zoicha to B'Seiros Toivos, Yeshuas V'Nachomis, and Refois, and we should be Zoicha B'Korov, to be as Goel Tzedek, be as Moshiach Tzedkeinu, B'Mheira V'Yomeinu, Amen.